They called her just a mom until the day she single-handedly dismantled a terrorist plot that had stumped federal agents for months. What they didn't know was that behind the soccer mom exterior was a former Army intelligence officer who'd spent 8 years tracking the world's most dangerous criminals. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The community center in Millbrook, Connecticut buzzed with the familiar chaos of a Tuesday evening PTA meeting. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows faced a makeshift podium where the school board president shuffled through papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd run dozens of these gatherings. The air smelled of burnt coffee and vanilla-scented hand sanitizer, a combination that had become the unofficial fragrance of suburban parent obligations. Sarah Chen sat in the back row, her weathered messenger bag occupying the seat beside her. Unlike the other parents who clustered in animated groups discussing weekend soccer tournaments and upcoming fundraisers, Sarah remained alone occasionally, checking her phone for messages that never seemed to come. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the unofficial uniform of every school volunteer: dark jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a fleece jacket that had seen better days. Around her, the usual suspects filled their customary positions. Margaret Henderson, the PTA president, commanded the front row like a general surveying her troops. Her perfectly highlighted hair never moved, even when she gestured emphatically about the urgent need for new playground equipment. Behind her sat the inner circle of power parents, women whose children attended every enrichment program and whose calendars were color-coded masterpieces of organizational perfection. 3 seats to Sarah's left, Jennifer Walsh whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear, "I don't understand why they keep asking for volunteers for the security committee. What does Sarah Chen know about school safety? She's never even been a room mom." The comment drew knowing nods from the women around her, the kind of dismissive agreement that had become Sarah's constant companion since moving to Millbrook 2 years ago. Sarah kept her expression neutral, her fingers tracing the edge of a worn notebook. Inside that notebook were pages of observations that would have surprised every person in this room. She documented entry points, assessed potential vulnerabilities, and noted patterns in the school's daily routines that others missed entirely. Not because she was paranoid, but because old habits died hard, and Sarah Chen had spent 8 years developing habits that kept people alive. The meeting droned on with discussions about budget allocations and upcoming events. When Margaret Henderson announced that they needed a new coordinator for the school safety initiative, the room erupted in the kind of polite chaos that characterized suburban democracy. Hands shot up immediately, accompanied by the confident voices of parents who'd never doubted their qualifications for anything. "I'll take it," declared Patricia Morrison, a former marketing executive who'd moved to Connecticut from Manhattan. "I've already researched the best security systems for schools. We need cameras, badge readers, the works." Her proposal drew murmurs of approval from the front row contingent. Sarah raised her hand quietly, the gesture so unexpected that Margaret Henderson actually paused mid-sentence. "Yes, Sarah?" she said, her tone carrying the patience typically reserved for children who'd interrupted adult conversations. "I'd like to volunteer for the security committee," Sarah said, her voice calm and professional. "I have some experience with threat assessment and emergency protocols." The room fell silent for a beat, then Jennifer Walsh's voice cut through the quiet. "What kind of experience? Managing carpool lanes?" The comment triggered a ripple of suppressed laughter from several parents. Margaret Henderson's smile was politely dismissive. "That's very nice, Sarah, but we're looking for someone with actual security experience. Patricia has already done extensive research on school safety systems." "I understand," Sarah replied, lowering her hand. She didn't speak again for the rest of the meeting. But Sarah's silence masked a growing concern that had nothing to do with hurt feelings or social exclusion. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd noticed things that set off alarm bells trained into her during her years with Army intelligence. Small things that individually meant nothing, but together painted a picture that made her increasingly uneasy. There was the landscaping truck that had been parked across from the school every Tuesday for the past month, always during pickup time, always with a different driver. The driver never worked on any visible landscaping project, just sat in the cab making phone calls while watching the school entrance. Sarah had noted the license plate, run a discreet background check through contacts she wasn't supposed to still have, and discovered the truck was registered to a shell company with no verifiable employees. Then there were the utility workers, who'd been updating infrastructure in the neighborhood for weeks. They worked in pairs, carried legitimate-looking equipment, and had official-looking uniforms. But Sarah had observed them through her kitchen window, and their behavior was wrong. Real utility workers focused on their tasks, worked efficiently, and moved in predictable patterns. These men spent too much time looking at houses, took too many breaks to make phone calls, and seemed far more interested in observing than working. Most troubling was the pattern of cars that had begun appearing in the school parking lot during off hours. Different vehicles, different times, but always the same behavior. Drivers who arrived, parked for exactly 20 minutes, then left without ever getting out of their cars. Sarah had documented 12 instances over 3 weeks, noting license plates, driver descriptions, and timing patterns that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Her training told her that surveillance teams were conducting reconnaissance on the school. But when she'd tried to voice her concerns to other parents, they dismissed her observations as the overactive imagination of a bored housewife. Jennifer Walsh had actually laughed when Sarah mentioned the utility workers, saying, "Honey, you need a hobby. Maybe join the book club instead of looking for conspiracies." After the PTA meeting ended, Sarah lingered in the parking lot, watching as the other parents climbed into their SUVs and drove away to their evening routines. The casual dismissal she'd experienced wasn't new, but tonight it felt particularly frustrating. These people saw her as nothing more than another suburban mom, someone whose biggest concern should be whether the school carnival would have enough volunteers to run the ring toss booth. They had no idea that Sarah Chen had spent 8 years as an intelligence analyst for the Army's 525th Military Intelligence Brigade. They didn't know that she'd tracked terrorist cells across 3 continents, identified threats that saved hundreds of lives, and earned commendations from generals whose names were classified. They couldn't see past the messenger bag and the mom genes to recognize that the woman they dismissed as just a mom had forgotten more about security than most of them would ever learn. But Sarah's military career felt like another lifetime, separated from her current reality by the kind of chasm that combat veterans understood, but rarely discussed. She'd left the Army when her daughter Emma was born, choosing the stability of civilian life over the demands of a career that had consumed every aspect of her existence. The transition had been harder than she'd expected, not just professionally but socially. Military communities understood her background, respected her expertise, and valued her contributions. Suburban Connecticut communities saw her as an outsider, who asked too many questions and didn't fit into their established social hierarchies. Her husband David had been supportive during the transition, but even he sometimes seemed to forget what she'd done before becoming a full-time parent. "Maybe you should try to blend in more," he'd suggested after she'd raised questions about the school's emergency evacuation procedures. "The other parents think you're a little intense." Sarah almost smiled at the irony. If wanting to keep children safe made her intense, she'd wear that label proudly. But she'd learned to keep her observations to herself, to smile politely when other parents discussed security measures that wouldn't stop a determined middle schooler, let alone an actual threat. As Sarah drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, she passed the landscaping truck parked in its usual spot. The driver was on his phone again, his body language suggesting an animated conversation. Through her peripheral vision, she noted that he was writing something down, which was odd for someone supposedly taking a personal call. She didn't slow down or change her route, but she made mental notes that would go into her private documentation when she got home. Date, time, location, driver description, vehicle position, activity observed. The same systematic approach she'd used to track insurgent cells in Afghanistan applied now to protecting a Connecticut elementary school that most people considered completely safe. Her phone buzzed with a text from David, running late from work. "Can you handle Emma's bedtime routine?" Sarah replied with a thumbs-up emoji that immediately felt guilty for the relief the message brought. Emma's bedtime routine meant stories, snuggles, and the kind of innocent conversations that reminded Sarah why she'd chosen this life. But it also meant another evening of pretending that everything was normal, that the growing pattern of surveillance around their community was just her imagination running wild. At home, Emma greeted her with the breathless excitement of a 7-year-old who'd spent the afternoon building elaborate Lego cities. "Mom, look what I made." "It's a police station with secret tunnels so the bad guys can't escape." Sarah admired the construction, marveling at her daughter's instinctive understanding that good security required thinking like the people you were trying to stop. As Emma chattered about her day, Sarah found herself studying their house with fresh eyes. The windows that provided lovely views of the neighborhood also offered clear sight lines for anyone conducting surveillance. The front door, while welcoming, was visible from multiple positions on the street. The backyard, which had seemed perfectly private when they bought the house, actually had several potential access points that someone with the right training could exploit. She was thinking like a target, which meant she was taking the threat seriously. But she was also thinking like a mother, which meant the stakes were personal in a way they'd never been during her military service. In Afghanistan, she'd analyzed threats against faceless potential victims. Here, the potential victim was her daughter, her neighbor's children, kids she'd watched grow up over the past 2 years. During Emma's bath time, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she recognized but hadn't seen in months. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, her former commanding officer. Sarah hesitated before answering, knowing that calls from her old life rarely brought good news. "Chen," she answered, using the clipped tone that had been second nature for 8 years. "Sarah, we need to talk." Webb's voice carried the kind of urgency that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "There's been some chatter about a potential domestic threat. Connecticut region. I can't discuss details over the phone, but I need to know if you've noticed anything unusual in your area." Sarah looked toward the bathroom where Emma was playing with rubber ducks, her laughter echoing off the tile walls. "Define unusual," she said carefully. "Surveillance patterns, reconnaissance activities, people or vehicles that don't belong." Webb's questions aligned so perfectly with Sarah's recent observations that she felt a chill run down her spine. "I may have noticed some things," she replied, "but I'd need to know more about what you're tracking before I share anything specific. Can you be in Hartford tomorrow morning? 1000 hours. There's a situation developing and we need someone with your analytical skills who's already positioned in the target area." Target area. The phrase hit Sarah like a physical blow. Millbrook wasn't just her home. It was apparently ground zero for something that had attracted federal attention. "Marcus, I'm not active duty anymore. I'm just a mom in a small town." "Sarah," Webb's voice softened slightly, "you're never just anything. And right now, you might be the only person in position to help us prevent something terrible." After ending the call, Sarah stood in her kitchen, staring out the window at the peaceful suburban street where her daughter rode bikes and played hopscotch. Somewhere out there, people were planning something that had prompted her former commanding officer to reach out to a retired intelligence analyst who'd been dismissed by her own community as an overprotective helicopter parent. The landscaping. Truck was gone from its usual spot, but Sarah noticed a white van parked 3 houses down that hadn't been there when she'd left for the PTA meeting. The van had municipal markings and looked completely legitimate, but its positioning offered a clear view of both the school bus route and the main intersection that controlled traffic flow through the neighborhood. Sarah Chen, the woman her neighbors saw as just a mom, was about to become something much more dangerous. She just didn't know it yet. The Hartford Federal Building loomed against the gray October sky, like a concrete monument to bureaucratic efficiency. Sarah had forgotten how intimidating government architecture could be, all sharp angles and tinted. Windows that revealed nothing of the critical work happening inside. She'd driven the 40-minute route from Millbrook in silence, her mind cycling through the possible scenarios that would prompt Marcus Webb to reactivate someone who'd been out of the intelligence community for 3 years. The security checkpoint felt both familiar and foreign. Sarah handed over her driver's license to a guard who looked young enough to be one of Emma's babysitters, but his eyes held the alertness of someone trained to spot threats in everyday interactions. Her hands remembered the routine of emptying pockets and removing shoes, muscle memory from countless military installations where security wasn't theater but necessity. "Ma'am, you'll need to sign in here and wait for your escort," the guard said, sliding a visitor's badge across the metal counter. The badge read Sarah Chen, contractor, in bold letters that felt like a demotion from her former security clearances. She clipped it to her jacket and took a seat in the sterile waiting area, surrounded by motivational posters about homeland security and vigilance that seemed designed more for reassurance than inspiration. Lieutenant Colonel Webb appeared exactly at 1000 hours, his punctuality as reliable as it had been during their years working together in Afghanistan. He looked older than Sarah remembered, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many late nights, spent analyzing threats that kept evolving faster than countermeasures could be developed. "Sarah, thank you for coming," he said, extending his hand with the kind of firm grip that conveyed both professionalism and genuine relief. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to meet." "You said it was about protecting kids," Sarah replied. "That's not exactly something I can ignore." They walked through corridors lined with photographs of federal agents and military personnel who'd made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. Sarah recognized some of the faces from joint operations, people whose expertise had been irreplaceable until the moment it was lost forever. The hallway served as a sobering reminder that the work they'd done carried consequences measured in lives, rather than quarterly reports. Webb led her to a secure conference room, where 3 other people waited around a table covered with manila folders, laptop computers, and coffee cups that suggested this meeting had been going on for hours before her arrival. He made introductions with the efficient courtesy of someone who valued time above social pleasantries. "Sarah Chen, former Army intelligence, counterterrorism specialist," Webb announced. "Sarah, meet Agent Jennifer Martinez from FBI Counterterrorism, Agent David Park from Homeland Security, and Dr. Elizabeth Thompson from the Defense Intelligence Agency." Sarah shook hands around the table, noting the way each person assessed her with the calculating gaze of professionals who'd learned not to trust appearances. She could practically hear their thoughts. This suburban mother was supposed to help them solve a case that had mobilized multiple federal agencies. Agent Martinez, a woman in her 40s with the kind of controlled energy that came from years of high-stakes investigations, gestured for Sarah to take a seat. "Miss Chen, before we begin, I need to establish your current security status. You held top-secret clearance until your separation from active duty, correct?" "That's correct," Sarah confirmed. "Though I assume that clearance has expired by now." "Actually, it hasn't," Dr. Thompson interjected, consulting a folder that contained more information about Sarah's military service than she'd expected anyone to still have. "Your clearance was placed on inactive status rather than terminated." We can reactivate it temporarily for this specific operation. The word carried weight that transformed this meeting from a casual consultation into something much more significant. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with crossing the threshold from civilian concerns to national security implications. Webb opened a laptop and angled the screen so Sarah could see a map of Connecticut, with several locations marked in red. Millbrook sat at the center of the display like a bullseye, surrounded by concentric circles that indicated surveillance zones and potential impact areas. 3 weeks ago, Webb began, an essay intercepted communications suggesting a domestic terrorist cell was conducting reconnaissance for a major operation targeting educational facilities. The intercepts were fragmentary, coded, and routed through multiple international servers to obscure their origin. Agent Park leaned forward, adding context in the measured tone of someone who'd briefed senior officials on similar threats. Initial analysis suggested the target was somewhere in the northeast corridor, but we couldn't narrow it down further. Then 2 weeks ago, we got more specific intelligence. He clicked to the next slide, showing a series of intercepted text messages and email fragments. The content was mundane enough to escape automated filtering systems, but when analyzed together, they revealed a pattern that made Sarah's blood run cold. Soccer practice Tuesday 3:30. Library book fair next week. Parent-teacher conferences Thursday evening. The messages read like typical suburban parent communications, but Sarah could see what had caught the analyst's attention. They were too generic, too perfectly ordinary, lacking the personal details that characterize genuine family conversations. These communications originated from cell towers near your neighborhood, Martinez explained. The senders were using burner phones, but they were geographically clustered around Millbrook Elementary School. Sarah studied the intercepted messages, her mind automatically cross-referencing the timestamps with her own observations. The timing aligns with increased surveillance activity I've noticed in the area. Vehicles that don't belong, people conducting what appears to be reconnaissance disguised as routine work. Dr. Thompson looked up from her notes with obvious interest. Can you be more specific about what you've observed? Sarah opened her messenger bag and pulled out the notebook she'd been carrying to PTA meetings. The other federal agents exchanged glances as she flipped through pages of detailed observations, sketches, and analysis that could have come from a professional surveillance report. Landscaping truck, white Ford F250, license plate GHN 7742. Positioned across from school entrance every Tuesday for 4 weeks, Sarah read from her notes. Driver changes weekly, but all exhibit similar behavioral patterns. Extended phone conversations, note-taking, minimal actual landscaping activity. Agent Martinez was taking notes rapidly. You ran the plate? Through unofficial channels, Sarah admitted. Registered to Northeast Facilities Management, which is a shell company, with no physical address and no verifiable employees. Webb smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Still thinking like an analyst, I see. Sarah continued reading from her observations, detailing the utility workers who'd spent weeks in the neighborhood without completing any visible infrastructure improvements, the pattern of vehicles that appeared in the school parking lot during off hours, and the subtle changes in local traffic patterns that suggested coordinated surveillance operations. This is remarkable, Agent Park said when she finished. You've documented a comprehensive surveillance operation that our field teams hadn't identified. Because your field teams weren't looking for it, Sarah replied. They were probably focused on traditional counterterrorism indicators, weapons, purchases, chemical supplies, suspicious financial transactions. This group is using a different approach. Dr. Thompson leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with new respect. What kind of approach? Sarah moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room and began sketching a timeline that connected her observations with the intercepted communications. They're conducting intelligence gathering using a cellular structure that mimics normal suburban activities. Each surveillance team operates independently, reporting through coded communications that look like typical parent conversations. She drew connecting lines between different observation points around the school, creating a pattern that revealed the true scope of the operation. They're not planning a traditional terrorist attack. They're planning something that requires detailed knowledge of daily routines, security vulnerabilities, and emergency response procedures. Agent Martinez set down her pen and looked directly at Sarah. "What do you think they're planning?" The question hung in the air while Sarah considered everything she'd observed and learned in the past hour. The surveillance patterns, the coded communications, the focus on educational facilities, and the careful timing that suggested months of preparation all pointed toward a conclusion that made her stomach tighten with dread. "A hostage situation," she said finally. "They're planning to take over the school during a high-visibility event when maximum numbers of parents and children will be present. The reconnaissance is designed to identify escape routes, security response times, and crowd control challenges." Webb nodded grimly. "That aligns with our analysis. The question is when and how we can prevent it." "Actually," Sarah said, returning to her notebook, "I think I might know when." She flipped to a page marked with a small star and read aloud, "November 15th, Family Science Night, annual event. High attendance, evening hours when security is minimal and parents are distracted by activities." Dr. Thompson consulted her laptop. "That's 3 weeks from today." "Which gives us time to prepare," Agent Martinez said. But her expression suggested she wasn't entirely optimistic about their chances. Sarah studied the faces around the table, seeing the mixture of hope and skepticism that came with bringing an outsider into an active investigation. These were competent professionals who dedicated their careers to preventing exactly this kind of threat. But they were also bureaucrats operating within systems that moved slowly and cautiously. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. Webb exchanged glances with the other agents before answering. "We need someone inside the community who can continue surveillance without arousing suspicion. Someone who understands both the terrorist mindset and the local environment." "You want me to go undercover in my own neighborhood?" "More than that," Agent Martinez said. "We need you to become actively involved in school security planning. Get yourself appointed to that safety committee you mentioned. Use your position to identify vulnerabilities and develop countermeasures." Sarah thought about the previous night's PTA meeting, the dismissive comments from other parents, and the casual assumption that just a mom couldn't possibly understand complex security issues. "The other parents aren't going to listen to me. They've made it clear that my input isn't valued." "Then you'll have to change their perception," Dr. Thompson said. "Find a way to demonstrate your expertise without revealing your background or compromising the investigation." The challenge was more complex than any intelligence operation Sarah had conducted during her military service. In Afghanistan, she'd operated with clear authority, established protocols, and team members who understood and respected her capabilities. Here, she'd be working alone in an environment where her neighbors saw her as an overprotective mother rather than a trained counterterrorism specialist. But as Sarah looked at the map of Millbrook with her daughter's school at the center of a terrorist plot, she realized that the stakes had never been higher. The technique she'd learned tracking insurgents across hostile territory would now be applied to protecting the place where Emma learned to read, where she'd made her first friends, where she felt safe and secure. Webb handed her a secure phone and a packet of documents that would give her temporary access to federal databases and communication networks. "Your cover is Sarah Chen, concerned parent with a background in corporate security consulting. That explains any expertise you demonstrate without raising questions about military service." "Corporate security consulting," Sarah repeated, testing how the cover story felt. Vague enough to be believable, specific enough to justify knowledge. Exactly. You'll report daily through encrypted channels, coordinate with our surveillance teams, and maintain your normal routine to avoid suspicion. As the meeting concluded and Sarah prepared to return to her life as a dismissed suburban mother, Agent Martinez pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Ms. Chen, I want you to understand something," Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many operations go wrong. "What we're asking you to do is extremely dangerous. If this terrorist cell suspects you're more than you appear to be, you and your family become targets." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. "Agent Martinez, with respect, my family is already a target. My daughter attends that school. My neighbor's children attend that school. The only difference is that now I have a chance to do something about it." As Sarah drove back to Millbrook, she passed the white van she'd noticed the previous evening. It was still parked in the same location, still positioned to observe key intersection patterns. But now she knew it wasn't her imagination or overprotective parenting instincts. It was the beginning of the most important mission of her life. The Millbrook Elementary cafeteria smelled of disinfectant and the lingering aroma of Tuesday's fish stick lunch special. Sarah arrived early for the emergency school board meeting, choosing a seat near the back wall where she could observe the entire room while maintaining clear sight lines to both exits. Old habits from briefing rooms in Kandahar now applied to folding chairs and hand sanitizer dispensers. The meeting had been called after a water main break flooded the school's main hallway, forcing administrators to confront security vulnerabilities they'd previously ignored. Sarah had learned about the meeting through the parent notification system, but she suspected the timing wasn't coincidental. Her federal contacts had mentioned that infrastructure failures often provided cover for reconnaissance activities. Principal Rebecca Morrison stood at the front of the room, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of stress that came from managing a crisis while maintaining normal operations. Behind her, a PowerPoint presentation displayed photos of the damage, buckled floor tiles, water-stained walls, and temporary barriers that had fundamentally altered the school's traffic patterns. "As you can see," Principal Morrison began, "the flooding has forced us to redesign our daily routines. Students are entering through the gymnasium entrance. Pickup procedures have moved to the north parking lot, and several classrooms have been relocated to the portable units behind the building." Sarah made notes in her civilian notebook while mentally cataloging how each change created new security vulnerabilities. The gymnasium entrance lacked the controlled access points of the main lobby. The north parking lot was visible from multiple public vantage points. The portable classrooms sat isolated from the main building's security systems and emergency communication networks. Margaret Henderson raised her hand with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to controlling school board discussions. "Principal Morrison, what's being done to ensure student safety during these temporary arrangements?" "We're working with our security consultant to evaluate the new protocols," Principal Morrison replied, gesturing toward a man Sarah didn't recognize. He was roughly 40 years old, wearing a navy blazer and khaki pants that screamed corporate contractor. But something about his posture and the way he scanned the room suggested a background that went beyond boardroom presentations. "I'd like to introduce Mark Stevens from Secure Educational Environments," Principal Morrison continued. "He's conducting a comprehensive security assessment and will be implementing new procedures to address our current challenges." Sarah studied Stevens carefully, noting details that other parents would miss. His shoes were practical rather than fashionable, suitable for extended periods of standing or rapid movement. He carried a portfolio that showed wear patterns consistent with frequent travel. Most tellingly, his eyes moved in systematic sweeps that covered potential threat vectors rather than focusing on whoever was speaking. Stevens stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd briefed anxious parents before. Thank you, Principal Morrison. I know this situation is concerning for all of you, but I want to assure everyone that student safety remains our top priority. His presentation covered standard security theater, visitor check-in procedures, staff identification protocols, and emergency communication systems that sounded impressive, but wouldn't stop a determined attacker. Sarah recognized the language from countless corporate security briefings she'd attended during her transition to civilian life, full of reassuring buzzwords that avoided discussing actual threats. But as Stevens continued, Sarah noticed something that made her pay closer attention. His security recommendations aligned suspiciously well with the vulnerabilities she'd identified in her own analysis. He suggested camera placements that would monitor the exact positions where she'd observed surveillance activities. He recommended traffic pattern changes that would funnel crowds through choke points that could be easily controlled. When Stevens opened the floor for questions, several parents raised predictable concerns about inconvenience and communication. Jennifer Walsh complained about the confusion at pickup time. Patricia Morrison worried about the impact on after-school activities. The questions were exactly what Sarah would expect from parents who viewed security as an administrative problem rather than a life-or-death responsibility. Sarah raised her hand, drawing the kind of attention she'd been trying to avoid since moving to Millbrook. Mr. Stevens, your recommendations seem focused on controlling access and monitoring movement. What provisions are you making for rapid evacuation if the building needs to be cleared quickly? Stevens paused, his professional smile faltering slightly. That's an excellent question. Our evacuation procedures are being updated to reflect the current facility configuration. But have you conducted actual evacuation drills using the new routes? Sarah pressed. Have you timed how long it takes to clear the building through the available exits? Have you identified potential bottlenecks that could trap people during an emergency? The room fell silent as other parents turned to look at Sarah with expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance. Margaret Henderson's face showed the particular irritation of someone whose meeting had been hijacked by an outsider asking uncomfortable questions. Mrs. Chen, Stevens said, consulting a notepad where he'd apparently written down her name. You seem to have some background in security matters. I've done some corporate consulting, Sarah replied, using the cover story Webb had provided. Risk assessment and emergency planning for business facilities. Stevens nodded as if this explained her expertise, but Sarah caught something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Perhaps you'd be willing to serve on our parent safety committee? We could use someone with your analytical approach. The offer came so smoothly that Sarah wondered if it had been planned. Either Stevens genuinely wanted community input, or he was testing whether she was more than she appeared to be. I'd be happy to contribute, she said, keeping her voice neutral. After the meeting ended, Sarah lingered in the parking lot, watching as other parents clustered around Stevens to ask follow-up questions. His answers were polished and reassuring, but she noticed that he seemed more interested in learning about family routines and school activities than in addressing specific security concerns. Her secure phone buzzed with a text message. Need to talk. Usual place, 1 hour. The message came from Agent Martinez, using code words they'd established for emergency communications. Sarah drove to the designated meeting location, a coffee shop in a neighboring town where federal agents could blend in with the usual crowd of remote workers and casual meetings. Martinez was already there, sitting at a corner table with a clear view of the entrance and her laptop open to what appeared to be work emails. Tell me about Mark Stevens, Martinez said without preamble as Sarah sat down. You know about him? We know he appeared at your school 3 days ago, just after the water main break. We know his company has no online presence beyond a basic website created last month. And we know his background check came back clean, which is suspicious in itself. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Martinez the notes she'd taken during The meeting. His security recommendations align too well with vulnerabilities I've identified. Either he's conducting the same analysis I am, or he already knows what he's looking for. Martinez studied Sarah's notes, occasionally asking questions about specific details. Did he seem surprised by your questions about evacuation procedures? He seemed more surprised that I was asking them than by the content, Sarah replied. Like he knew the answers, but wasn't expecting to be challenged by a parent. That's because most parents don't ask those kinds of questions, Martinez said grimly. They assume someone else has thought through the worst-case scenarios. Sarah sipped her coffee while processing the implications. You think Stevens is connected to the terrorist cell? We think Stevens might be conducting advanced reconnaissance disguised as legitimate security consulting, Martinez replied. It's a perfect cover for mapping vulnerabilities, studying response procedures, and identifying optimal timing for an attack. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not only was her daughter's school being targeted by terrorists, but the person supposedly protecting it might be working with the attackers. What do you need me to do? Martinez handed her a small device that looked like a standard USB drive. This contains surveillance software that can monitor Stevens' activities if you can get access to his computer or phone for 30 seconds. Can you do that? Sarah thought about the safety committee meeting Stevens had just invited her to join. He asked me to serve on the parent safety committee. I'll have opportunities to get close to him during planning sessions. Be careful, Martinez warned. If Stevens is who we think he is, he's trained in counter-surveillance and threat detection. One mistake could expose you and put your family in immediate danger. Over the next week, Sarah threw herself into the role of concerned parent turned security volunteer. She attended committee meetings, offered suggestions for improving safety protocols, and gradually positioned herself as Stevens' unofficial assistant for community liaison activities. The other parents seemed relieved that someone else was willing to handle the detailed work of security planning, allowing them to focus on more appealing volunteer opportunities. Stevens proved to be an excellent actor, displaying just the right combination of professional expertise and parental concern. He knew the terminology, understood the protocols, and asked thoughtful questions about the school's unique challenges. But Sarah noticed inconsistencies that suggested his knowledge came from briefings rather than experience. During one committee meeting, Stevens mentioned conducting similar assessments at schools in California and Texas. But when Sarah asked specific questions about regional differences in emergency response protocols, his answers were vague and generic. He talked about best practices and industry standards without demonstrating the deep familiarity that came from actually implementing security measures in diverse environments. More troubling were the questions Stevens asked about student and parent routines. He wanted to know which families attended every school event, which children had special medical needs that might require assistance during evacuations, and which parents had leadership roles that others would follow during emergencies. His interest seemed to go beyond security planning into operational intelligence gathering. Sarah's breakthrough came during an evening planning session when Stevens stepped away to take a phone call, leaving his laptop open on the conference table. She had less than 2 minutes before he returned, but the surveillance device Martinez had given her only needed 30 seconds of contact with his computer. As she inserted the USB drive, Sarah could hear Stevens' voice through the partially open door. He was speaking in what sounded like Arabic, his tone urgent and businesslike. She couldn't understand the words, but the cadence suggested he was receiving instructions rather than giving them. The software installation completed just as Stevens ended his call. Sarah had the device hidden in her palm when he returned to the room, apologizing for the interruption and explaining it as a call from another client with an urgent question. "No problem," Sarah replied, maintaining the friendly efficiency she'd cultivated over weeks of working together. I was just reviewing the evacuation timeline for Family Science Night. Stephen's expression sharpened slightly at the mention of the November 15th event. That's going to be our biggest security challenge. High attendance, evening hours, families moving freely throughout the building. Do you think we should consider additional security measures for that event specifically? Sarah asked, watching his reaction carefully. Absolutely, Stevens replied. I'm developing comprehensive protocols for high-attendance events. We want to ensure everyone feels safe and secure. But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and Sarah realized she was looking at someone who was planning exactly the opposite. Mark Stevens wasn't protecting Family Science Night. He was preparing for it. That evening, Sarah transmitted the surveillance data to Martinez, while David helped Emma with homework at the kitchen table. The ordinary domestic scene felt surreal, given the life-or-death intelligence operation, happening feet away from math worksheets and reading assignments. Her secure phone buzzed with a response, faster than she'd expected. Critical intelligence recovered. Stevens is operational commander for planned attack. Abort codes and timing confirmed. Family Science Night is primary target. Maintain cover, but minimize exposure. Sarah stared at the message, feeling the weight of confirmation that her worst fears were justified. The man she'd been working alongside for weeks, the security consultant trusted by every parent in Millbrook, was leading a terrorist operation designed to turn her daughter's school into a battlefield. But now, Sarah Chen knew something the terrorists didn't expect. Their inside man was being watched by someone who understood their methods better than they realized. The invisible mom they'd dismissed was about to become their worst nightmare. Sarah stood in her kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, staring at the surveillance photos Agent Martinez had sent to her secure phone. The images showed Mark Stevens meeting with 3 other individuals in the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse 15 miles from Millbrook. The timestamp indicated the meeting had occurred just 4 hours after their safety committee session where Stevens had discussed comprehensive protocols for Family Science Night. The faces in the photos were sharp and clear, captured by federal surveillance equipment that could identify individuals from remarkable distances. 2 of the men appeared to be in their 30s, wearing casual clothing that would blend into any suburban environment. The third was older, maybe 50, with the kind of weathered features that suggested extensive time in harsh climates. All 3 carried themselves with the alert posture of people trained in violence, but it was the equipment visible in the background that made Sarah's blood run cold. Stacked against the warehouse wall were wooden crates marked with shipping labels she recognized from her intelligence training. The markings indicated communications equipment, tactical gear, and other supplies that had no legitimate purpose for a school security consultant. Her phone buzzed with a follow-up message from Martinez. Facial recognition confirms international connections. 2 subjects match known associates of Middle Eastern terrorist organizations. Third subject is former military, discharged under circumstances that remain classified. This is bigger than we initially assessed. Sarah deleted the message and began her morning routine, the familiar actions of making coffee and preparing Emma's lunch, providing a thin veneer of normalcy over the growing crisis. Through her kitchen window, she could see the white van that had become a permanent fixture 3 houses down. The vehicle looked innocuous enough, but now she knew it contained trained operatives, conducting final reconnaissance for an attack that was less than 2 weeks away. David emerged from the shower as Sarah was packing Emma's backpack, his hair still damp and his expression showing the mild confusion of someone who hadn't fully awakened. "You're up early," he observed, reaching for the coffee pot with the grateful urgency of a man facing another day of corporate meetings. "Couldn't sleep," Sarah replied, which was true enough. She'd spent most of the night analyzing the intelligence Martinez had shared, cross-referencing the terrorist profiles with her own observations of suspicious activity around the school. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated operation months in the planning, with resources and expertise that went far beyond anything local law enforcement was equipped to handle. Emma bounded into the kitchen with the infectious energy of a 7-year-old who viewed each new day as an adventure waiting to unfold. Her backpack was covered with patches from various school activities, and she wore the confident smile of a child who felt completely safe in her small-town environment. "Mom, don't forget I have art class today," Emma announced, climbing onto her chair at the breakfast table. "Mrs. Peterson said we're going to paint pictures of our families. Can you help me think of what to include?" Sarah felt her heart tighten as she looked at her daughter's trusting face. Emma had no idea that dangerous people were planning to turn her school into a target, that the security consultant everyone trusted was actually coordinating an attack that could shatter the peace of their small community forever. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Include whatever makes you happy, sweetheart, Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. Paint the people and things that make you feel safe and loved. As they drove to school, Sarah found herself studying every detail of the route with new urgency. The tree-lined streets that had seemed charming when they'd moved to Millbrook now represented potential cover for attackers. The quiet intersections that made the neighborhood feel peaceful could become choke points that trapped fleeing families. The very isolation that made the community attractive to young parents also made it vulnerable to people who wanted to operate without witnesses. Emma chattered about her upcoming art project, oblivious to her mother's growing tension. Sarah managed to maintain appropriate responses while simultaneously cataloging tactical considerations, sightlines, escape routes, defensive positions, and the countless variables that could determine whether people lived or died when violence erupted in unexpected places. At the school drop-off, Sarah watched Emma skip toward the building with her friends, their laughter echoing across the parking lot. Other parents waved goodbye from their cars, most of them already thinking about work meetings and afternoon schedules. None of them understood that their children were walking into a location that had been mapped, studied, and prepared for attack by people who viewed innocent lives as acceptable casualties in pursuit of their extremist goals. Sarah's secure phone buzzed with a message requesting an immediate meeting. She drove to a different location this time, a public library in a town 30 minutes away where Martinez waited in the periodical section, surrounded by newspapers and magazines that provided perfect cover for sensitive conversations. "We've identified the full scope of the operation," Martinez said without preamble, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Stevens isn't just conducting reconnaissance. He's coordinating with at least 6 other operatives who've been positioning themselves throughout the region over the past 3 months. Sarah opened the folder to find detailed surveillance photos, communication intercepts, and analysis reports that painted a terrifying picture. The terrorists weren't planning a simple attack on Millbrook Elementary. They were preparing for a coordinated assault that would overwhelm local emergency response capabilities and create maximum psychological impact through sustained media coverage. Family Science Night was chosen specifically because it guarantees maximum casualties, Martinez continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Parents and children together in an enclosed space. Evening hours when emergency response is slower, and a community event that will attract extensive news coverage. The tactical analysis was brutally efficient. The terrorists had studied police response times, hospital capacity, and media protocols to design an attack that would cause maximum damage while ensuring their message reached the widest possible audience. They'd even factored in the likelihood that cell phone videos from inside the school would provide real-time documentation of the assault. "What's our timeline for intervention?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That's the problem," Martinez replied grimly. We can't move against Stevens or his associates without solid evidence of imminent criminal activity. Surveillance and planning aren't crimes until they cross the line into actual preparation for violence. Sarah understood the legal constraints that bound federal law enforcement, but she also understood the tactical reality of waiting too long to act. By the time you have enough evidence to arrest them, it'll be too late to prevent the attack. Which is why we need you to gather that evidence, Martinez said, pulling out a small recording device disguised as a typical smartphone accessory. Stevens trusts you now. You have access to planning meetings and private conversations. We need recorded proof of their intentions. The request was more dangerous than anything Sarah had done during her military service. In Afghanistan, she'd operated with backup, clear rules of engagement, and the authority to defend herself when threatened. Here, she'd be gathering evidence alone, surrounded by trained killers who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their operation. If Stevens suspects I'm recording him, my family becomes an immediate target, Sarah said. If we don't stop this attack, your family becomes a target anyway, Martinez replied, along with hundreds of other families who have no idea what's coming. Sarah returned to Millbrook with the recording device hidden in her messenger bag and a growing sense that she was running out of time. The next safety committee meeting was scheduled for that evening, which would give her an opportunity to document Stevens' involvement in the terrorist plot. But it would also put her in a room with a man who'd already demonstrated his willingness to plan mass violence against children. The afternoon passed with excruciating normalcy. Sarah attended a parent-teacher conference where Emma's instructor praised her daughter's creativity and enthusiasm. She stopped at the grocery store where neighbors discussed weekend plans and upcoming school events. She picked up dry cleaning and returned library books, ordinary tasks that felt surreal given the extraordinary circumstances she was navigating. But beneath the surface of suburban routine, Sarah was conducting final preparation for what might be the most important intelligence gathering operation of her life. She tested the recording device, reviewed her cover story, and mentally rehearsed responses to questions that might expose her true purpose. The safety committee met in the school library after hours, when the building was quiet and their conversations wouldn't be overheard by students or staff. Stevens had arranged the meeting to finalize security protocols for Family Science Night, though Sarah now understood his real purpose was to coordinate final details for the terrorist attack. 3 other parents attended the meeting. Margaret Henderson, who viewed security planning as another opportunity to demonstrate her leadership skills. Patricia Morrison, who brought her business background to discussions of logistics and coordination. And Jennifer Walsh, who seemed primarily interested in ensuring that security measures didn't interfere with her social activities. Stevens began with a presentation that covered crowd control measures, emergency communication procedures, and staff assignments for the November 15th event. His recommendations were professionally presented and thoroughly researched, but Sarah recognized details that served the attacker's purposes rather than genuine security needs. I want to ensure we have clear sight lines throughout the building, Stevens explained, pointing to a floor plan marked with proposed camera positions. That means removing some decorative elements and rearranging furniture to eliminate hiding places. Sarah understood that eliminating hiding places would benefit attackers more than defenders, making it impossible for children and parents to take cover during an assault. But the other committee members nodded approvingly, impressed by Stevens' attention to detail. What about lockdown procedures? Sarah asked, activating the recording device concealed in her bag. If we need to secure the building quickly, how do we ensure all areas can be isolated effectively? Stevens' response was smooth and professional, but Sarah caught subtle details that revealed his true knowledge of the building's vulnerabilities. He mentioned electrical systems that weren't included in standard building plans, described corridor layouts with the precision of someone who'd conducted detailed reconnaissance, and referenced emergency protocols that had never been shared. With the parent committee as the meeting progressed, Sarah guided the conversation toward operational details, asking questions that prompted Stevens to reveal more about his planning process. She inquired about communication systems, evacuation routes, and coordination with local law enforcement, each question designed to document his knowledge of information that no legitimate security consultant should possess. The breakthrough came when Patricia Morrison asked about backup plans if the primary security measures failed. Stevens' answer included details about response times, tactical capabilities, and command structure that demonstrated intimate knowledge of local emergency services limitations. "How do you know so much about police response protocols?" Sarah asked, making the question sound like professional curiosity rather than suspicion. Stevens paused for a fraction of a second before answering, and Sarah caught something in his expression that suggested he'd realized he'd revealed too much. "I've worked with law enforcement agencies in other communities," he said. "Standard protocols are fairly consistent across different jurisdictions." But his explanation didn't account for his specific knowledge of Millbrook's unique geographical and operational constraints. Sarah had the evidence Martinez needed, but she also realized that Stevens was becoming suspicious of her persistent questions. The meeting ended with assignments for final preparations, but as the other parents gathered their materials and headed for the parking lot, Stevens lingered behind. He approached Sarah with the kind of focused attention that made her acutely aware of the isolation of the empty school building. Double quotes. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" Stevens said, his voice carrying that casual friendliness that didn't match the intensity in his eyes. "You seem to have more security experience than most parents. Where exactly did you work before moving to Millbrook?" The question was a test, and Sarah understood that her answer would determine whether she maintained her cover or became an immediate threat that needed to be eliminated. She'd gathered the evidence federal agents needed to prevent the attack, but now she had to survive long enough to deliver it. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but years of intelligence training had taught her to control her physiological responses under pressure. She met Stevens' penetrating gaze with the practiced calm of someone who'd been interrogated by people far more dangerous than a suburban security consultant. "I worked for Meridian Risk Solutions in Boston," she replied, using the cover identity Webb's team had constructed for her. "Corporate security assessments, mainly financial institutions and technology companies. Nothing as complex as educational facilities, which is why I've been asking so many questions." Stevens nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on her face with the calculating attention of someone trained to detect deception. "Meridian Risk Solutions. I'm not familiar with that firm. We were acquired by a larger consulting group about 2 years ago," Sarah said, adding details that would explain why an internet search might not yield extensive information. "Most of our client work was confidential, so we maintained a fairly low public profile." The explanation was plausible enough to satisfy casual inquiry, but Sarah could see Stevens filing away every detail for later verification. She needed to end this conversation before his suspicion hardened into certainty that she was more than she appeared to be. "I should get home," Sarah said, gathering her materials with the efficiency of a parent managing multiple evening responsibilities. "Emma has a spelling test tomorrow, and I promised to help her study." Stevens stepped aside to let her pass, but his movement was controlled rather than casual, maintaining position to block her path to the exit if necessary. Of course, family comes first. The walk to the parking lot felt longer than usual, every step measured under Stevens' observation. Sarah forced herself to maintain normal pace and posture, resisting the urge to look back or hurry toward her car. But she could feel his attention like a physical weight, analyzing her movements for signs of deception or threat. Once inside her vehicle, Sarah waited until she was several blocks away before calling Martinez on the secure phone. The conversation was brief and coded, but the message was clear. She'd obtained recorded evidence of Stevens' operational knowledge, but her cover might be compromised. "Accelerate timeline," Martinez replied. "Can you meet tonight?" "Not possible. Family obligations." Sarah couldn't risk another unexplained absence that might confirm Stevens' suspicions. "Tomorrow, early morning." At home, David was helping Emma with homework at the kitchen table, their heads bent over worksheets in the kind of peaceful domestic scene that felt increasingly precious given the threats gathering around their community. Emma looked up as Sarah entered, her face brightening with the uncomplicated joy of a child who trusted that her parents could handle any problem. "Mom, I got all my math problems right," Emma announced, holding up her worksheet with pride. "Dad said we could have ice cream if I finished before bedtime." Sarah managed a genuine smile despite the tension coiling in her chest. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You've been working so hard on those multiplication tables." But as she helped Emma gather her school materials for the next day, Sarah found herself memorizing details with the intensity of someone who might never see them again. The way Emma's hair caught the kitchen light, the sound of her laughter as David made silly voices while reading her bedtime story, the comfortable routine of a family that believed their biggest challenges involved homework and household chores. After Emma was asleep, Sarah and David sat on their back deck with glasses of wine, maintaining the appearance of a normal evening while Sarah's mind raced through contingency plans and threat assessments. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and the distant sound of neighbors settling in for the night, all of it creating an illusion of safety that Sarah knew was about to be shattered. "You seem tense lately," David observed, his voice carrying the concern of someone who'd noticed changes but didn't understand their significance. "Is everything okay with the school committee work?" Sarah considered how much she could tell him, without violating operational security or putting him in additional danger. "Just some personality conflicts with other volunteers. Nothing I can't handle." David accepted the explanation because it fit patterns he'd observed since their move to Millbrook. Sarah's difficulty integrating with the local parent community was something they'd discussed before, and it provided perfect cover for her current stress levels. But lying to her husband about threats against their daughter felt like another form of betrayal, adding to the isolation that came with operating alone in hostile territory. Sarah had never experienced this kind of compartmentalization during her military service, where team members shared both information and risk in pursuit of common objectives. The next morning brought news that accelerated everything. Sarah's secure phone buzzed with an urgent message as she was preparing Emma's breakfast. "Stevens departed location. 400 hours. Surveillance lost contact. Assume compromise imminent." The message meant that Stevens had either fled or gone underground, potentially taking operational plans and intelligence about federal countermeasures with him. It also meant that Sarah's cover was blown and her family was now in immediate danger from people who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate potential witnesses. Sarah maintained her normal routine while her mind shifted into crisis management mode. She drove Emma to school as usual, but took a route that allowed her to check for surveillance and identify potential threats. The white van was gone from its observation post, replaced by an empty stretch of curb that somehow felt more ominous than the obvious surveillance had been at the school drop-off. Sarah hugged Emma with the fierce intensity of someone who wasn't certain when she'd see her daughter again. "I love you, sweetheart. Remember that no matter what happens." Emma looked puzzled by the emotional intensity, but returned the hug with 7-year-old enthusiasm. "I love you too, Mom. See you after school." Sarah watched Emma disappear into the building, then drove directly to the emergency meeting location Martinez had specified. The federal agent was waiting in a hotel conference room that had been converted into a temporary command post, complete with communication equipment and tactical displays that showed the current status of the investigation. "Stevens is in the wind," Martinez reported without preamble. He cleared out of his hotel room sometime after midnight, and we haven't been able to re-establish contact with any of his known associates. Sarah handed over the recording device, knowing that the evidence it contained might be the only proof of the terrorist plot now that the primary suspects had vanished. The recordings document his operational knowledge and planning details. It should be enough to justify aggressive countermeasures. Martinez plugged the device into a laptop and began reviewing the audio files, her expression growing more concerned as she heard Stephen's detailed knowledge of security vulnerabilities and emergency response limitations. This is definitely actionable intelligence. The problem is we no longer know where the attackers are or whether they've accelerated their timeline. The tactical situation had deteriorated from a controlled intelligence operation into a potential crisis with unknown parameters. Stevens and his associates were experienced operatives who understood counterintelligence procedures and had demonstrated their ability to disappear when their operation was threatened. "What's the plan for protecting the school?" Sarah asked. "We're implementing full security measures immediately," Martinez replied. "Federal agents will be positioned around the building. Local law enforcement has been briefed on the threat, and we're coordinating with school administration to modify access procedures." But Sarah understood the limitations of defensive measures against attackers who'd spent months studying their target. Stevens knew the building layout, security systems, and emergency procedures better than many of the people tasked with protecting it. His inside knowledge gave him significant advantages that federal agents would struggle to overcome. "They won't attack the school now," Sarah said, thinking through the tactical implications. Stevens knows we're watching it. "They'll find another target, something that gives them the psychological impact they're seeking without the security risks." Martinez paused in her review of the recordings. "What kind of alternative target?" Sarah opened her laptop and pulled up a calendar of local events, cross-referencing activities that would provide the crowd density and symbolic value the terrorists needed. Family Science Night was chosen for specific reasons: high attendance, emotional significance, media impact. They need something that provides the same benefits. The list was disturbingly long. Halloween festivals, youth sports championships, school concerts, and community celebrations that would attract hundreds of families to relatively unprotected venues. Each event represented potential casualties and the kind of psychological trauma that terrorist organizations use to amplify their message beyond the immediate victims. "We can't protect every community gathering in the region," Martinez said, voicing the operational reality that law enforcement faced against asymmetric threats. "We need to narrow down their most likely targets." Sarah studied the calendar while thinking like the intelligence analyst she'd been trained to be. Stevens and his associates were professional operatives who wouldn't abandon months of planning without attempting to salvage their mission. They'd look for alternatives that provided maximum impact with minimum risk, targets that offered psychological value without the security complications that now surrounded Millbrook Elementary. "Here," Sarah said, pointing to an entry 3 days away: Riverside Community Center, Annual Fall Festival. 500 expected attendees, mostly families with children. Limited security, single building with restricted exit points, and symbolic value as a community gathering place. Martinez studied the information, her expression showing recognition of the tactical advantages the location offered. "How did you identify this?" "Because it's what I would choose if I were planning this operation," Sarah replied. "Riverside is close enough to Millbrook to satisfy their geographic requirements, but far enough away to avoid the enhanced security we've implemented. It provides the same target demographics as Family Science Night, with better operational security." The realization that transformed Sarah from intelligence gatherer to active participant in a counterterrorism operation came when Martinez began coordinating federal response to the Riverside threat. Watching the familiar process of threat assessment and resource allocation, Sarah understood that she possessed knowledge and capabilities that could make the difference between stopping the attack and responding to its aftermath. "I want to help with the Riverside operation," Sarah said. Martinez looked up from her communications equipment. "Sarah, you've already done more than we had any right to ask. Your family needs you to stay safe." "My family needs me to stop these people before they hurt other children," Sarah replied. "I know Stephen's planning methods, his operational preferences, and his psychological profile better than anyone on your team. You need that knowledge." The argument was sound from a tactical perspective, but Martinez hesitated before responding. Federal operations were governed by protocols and jurisdictional authorities that didn't easily accommodate civilian contractors, especially parents whose emotional investment might compromise their professional judgment. But Sarah Chen wasn't just any civilian contractor. She was a trained intelligence operative who'd spent months inside the terrorist cell, someone whose unique position and specialized knowledge made her invaluable for the final phase of the operation. "What exactly are you proposing?" Martinez asked. Sarah pulled out her phone and began outlining a plan that would use her civilian status and local knowledge to identify the terrorists before they could implement their attack. It was dangerous, unconventional, and probably violated several federal regulations about civilian involvement in active operations. It was also their best chance of stopping Stevens before he turned another community gathering into a battlefield. Riverside Community Center parking lot buzzed with the cheerful chaos of a small-town fall festival. Children in Halloween costumes ran between booths selling homemade crafts and local produce, their laughter mixing with the sounds of acoustic guitar music from the main stage. Parents juggled coffee cups and camera phones trying to capture memories of an event that represented everything wholesome about American community life. Sarah stood near the entrance, watching families stream through the doors with the trained eye of someone who'd learned to spot threats in crowded environments. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a fleece jacket that made her indistinguishable from hundreds of other parents. But beneath the civilian exterior, she carried equipment that transformed her into a federal surveillance operative, the earpiece hidden beneath her hair connected her to Martinez and the tactical team positioned around the perimeter. The camera, disguised as a festival volunteer badge, recorded everything she observed for real-time analysis by federal agents, monitoring the operation from a command vehicle parked 3 blocks away. "Overwatch 1, this is ground asset," Sarah spoke quietly into the microphone concealed in her jacket collar. "Initial sweep complete. No sign of primary targets, but I'm seeing potential support personnel." Martinez's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Describe what you're observing." Sarah moved toward the craft booths, maintaining the casual demeanor of a parent browsing festival offerings while systematically scanning faces in the crowd. 2 males, early 30s, positioned near emergency exits. They're not engaging with vendors or activities, just observing crowd patterns and security measures. The men she'd identified wore casual clothing appropriate for a community festival, but their behavior set them apart from genuine attendees. They maintained positions that provided clear sightlines to multiple areas while staying near exit routes. Most tellingly, they showed no interest in the festival activities, despite having paid admission fees to enter. "Can you get closer for visual confirmation?" Martinez asked. Sarah purchased a cup of apple cider from a nearby booth, using the transaction as cover to position herself within earshot of the suspected surveillance team. The closer proximity confirmed her assessment. These men were conducting reconnaissance, noting security guard positions and crowd density while maintaining communication through concealed radio equipment. "Confirmed surveillance team," Sarah reported. "They're mapping the venue and monitoring our security presence." This fits Stephen's operational pattern from the school assessment. The festival continued around them, families enjoying traditional autumn activities while federal agents prepared for a confrontation that could erupt into violence at any moment. Sarah felt the familiar tension of operating in hostile territory, but this time the stakes included her own neighbors and their children rather than abstract strategic objectives. Her secure phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood run cold. "Mommy, having fun at the school carnival? Hope you and Emma enjoy the festivities. A concerned friend." The message came from an unknown number, but Sarah recognized the implied threat immediately. Someone was watching her family, using Emma's presence at a school event as leverage to influence Sarah's actions during the federal operation. "Martinez, I've been compromised," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "They know about my family. What's your status?" Sarah moved toward a quieter area near the community center's rear entrance, away from the crowds and closer to potential extraction routes. "I received a threat against my daughter. Someone's monitoring my family while I'm here." The tactical situation had just become exponentially more complex. Sarah was no longer just gathering intelligence. She was being manipulated by people who understood that threatening her child would compromise her operational effectiveness and potentially force her to make decisions that benefited the terrorists rather than the federal response. "We can extract you immediately," Martinez offered. "Negative. If I leave now, they'll know we're onto them, and they'll either abort or relocate to a target we haven't identified." Sarah made the calculation with the cold logic her military training had instilled, even as her maternal instincts screamed for her to abandon the mission and protect her daughter. But Sarah also understood that the best way to protect Emma was to stop Stevens and his associates before they could implement any attack. Running away might provide short-term safety, but would leave the terrorists free to strike other targets, where children just like Emma would be equally vulnerable. "Maintain surveillance," Sarah decided. "But I need immediate protection for my family." Martinez acknowledged the request, and Sarah knew that federal agents were already moving to secure Emma's location. But the knowledge that her daughter was being used as a pawn in a terrorist operation filled Sarah with a cold rage that she channeled into tactical focus. The festival's main event was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, when hundreds of families would gather in the community center's main hall for a costume contest and musical performance. If Stevens intended to attack this venue, the timing would coincide with maximum attendance and minimum ability for people to evacuate quickly. Sarah positioned herself near the main entrance, continuing her systematic observation of arriving families while searching for faces that matched the terrorist profiles Martinez had shared. The crowd included parents she recognized from Millbrook, children who attended school with Emma, and elderly community members who'd been organizing fall festivals for decades. The normalcy of the scene made the impending threat feel surreal. But Sarah's training had taught her that violence often erupted in the most peaceful settings. The contrast between innocence and danger wasn't coincidental. It was precisely what made civilian targets attractive to people who measured success by psychological impact rather than strategic value. Her earpiece crackled with an update from the perimeter team. "Ground asset, we have movement at the north entrance." 3 males matching suspect descriptions entering the venue. Sarah turned toward the specified location and felt her heart skip as she recognized Mark Stevens despite his attempt at disguise. He'd grown a beard and wore a baseball cap pulled low over his features, but his movement patterns and body language were unmistakable to someone who'd studied them for weeks. "Primary target confirmed," Sarah reported. Stevens just entered through the north door with 2 associates. The moment she'd been preparing for had arrived, but seeing Stevens in person reminded Sarah that this wasn't a theoretical exercise. This was a trained killer who'd spent months planning an attack designed to maximize casualties among families just like hers. Stevens moved through the crowd with the casual confidence of someone who belonged at a community festival, stopping to admire children's costumes and chat with vendors as if he were a local parent enjoying an autumn tradition. But Sarah caught details that revealed his true purpose: the way he assessed exit routes, the systematic scanning of security measures, and the subtle hand signals he used to coordinate with his associates. "They're conducting final reconnaissance," Sarah observed. "This isn't just surveillance. They're preparing for immediate action." Martinez's voice carried new urgency. "Can you maintain visual contact while we position tactical units?" Sarah began moving through the crowd, using festival activities as cover while tracking Stevens and his team. The challenge was maintaining surveillance without alerting them to federal interest, a delicate balance that required her to appear completely ordinary while conducting sophisticated intelligence gathering. Stevens paused near the main stage where a local high school band was setting up equipment for the evening performance. Sarah watched him assess the acoustic conditions, sight lines, and crowd capacity with the analytical attention of someone planning an operation that would require precise timing and positioning. His phone buzzed, and Sarah moved closer to observe his reaction to whatever message he'd received. Stevens' expression hardened as he read the text, then he looked up and began scanning the crowd with new intensity. "Something's changed," Sarah reported. "Stevens received communications that have increased his alert level." The shift in his behavior suggested that the terrorist team had detected federal surveillance or received intelligence about the enhanced security measures. Sarah realized that they might be preparing to abort this target and relocate to an alternative venue, potentially one where federal agents hadn't positioned countermeasures. But Stevens didn't move toward the exits. Instead, he gestured to his associates and began positioning them around the main hall in a pattern that Sarah recognized from tactical manuals. They were establishing fields of fire and controlling key positions, preparing for an operation that would begin soon regardless of federal presence. "Martinez, they're not aborting," Sarah said, feeling adrenaline flood her system as she recognized the unmistakable signs of an imminent attack. "They're implementing the operation now." The realization that the attack was beginning transformed the festival from a surveillance operation into an active crisis. Around Sarah, families continued enjoying autumn activities while terrorists prepared to turn their community gathering into a battlefield. Stevens raised his hand to his ear, indicating he was receiving final instructions through a concealed communication device. His associates moved to their assigned positions, each one controlling access points that would be critical during the chaos that was about to erupt. Sarah's training had prepared her for this moment, but the reality of watching an attack unfold among innocent families created a kind of stress she'd never experienced during military operations. These weren't soldiers who'd accepted the risks of combat. They were children and parents who'd come to a festival expecting nothing more dangerous than too much candy and face paint. "Federal agents are moving to intercept," Martinez reported through the earpiece. "Maintain your position and continue providing intelligence." But Sarah Chen was no longer just an intelligence asset, providing information to federal agents. She was a mother watching terrorists prepare to attack a community gathering that included children, just like her daughter, and she was the only person in position to stop them. The costume contest announcement echoed through the community center as families began gathering in the main hall for the festival's highlight event. Stevens checked his watch and nodded to his associates, confirming that the attack would coincide with maximum attendance and minimum escape options. Sarah made her decision with the clarity that came from years of training and the fierce protectiveness of a parent who understood that some threats could only be stopped by people willing to act. When action was needed, she was about to discover whether the dismissed suburban mother could become something far more dangerous when her community needed her most. The moment Sarah realized the attack was imminent, time seemed to compress into a series of crystalline decisions that would determine whether hundreds of families lived or died. Stevens had positioned his associates at strategic points around the main hall, creating overlapping fields of control that would trap everyone inside once the violence began. Sarah keyed her microphone. One final time. Martinez, they're moving to final positions. You have maybe 90 seconds before this goes active. Federal units are 30 seconds out, Martinez replied. Hold your position. But Sarah could see what the tactical team couldn't from there. External positions. Stevens was reaching into his jacket, his movement deliberate and practiced. His associates were doing the same, their synchronized actions confirming that the attack was beginning now. Not in 30 seconds when federal agents could intervene. The main hall buzzed with anticipation as parents helped children line up for the costume contest. A local teacher stood at the microphone, calling out categories while families applauded and took photos. The normalcy felt obscene given what Sarah knew was about to shatter this innocent gathering. Sarah moved toward Stevens with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged in the crowd. She'd identified his position near the sound equipment, a location that would give him tactical advantages once the attack began. But it also meant he was focused on the stage rather than potential threats approaching from behind. 20 feet away from Stevens, Sarah made a decision that violated every federal protocol about civilian involvement in active operations. Instead of maintaining surveillance and waiting for backup, she stepped out of her role as intelligence asset and became something far more dangerous. She'd noticed during their weeks of working together that Stevens carried his phone in his left jacket pocket and kept his right hand free for weapons access. She'd also observed that he favored positions near walls that protected his back while giving him clear sight lines to potential threats. But Stevens hadn't accounted for a threat that looked like every other parent in the room. Sarah approached from his left side, using a family with young children as visual cover until she was close enough to act. Her movement was casual and unthreatening, the kind of minor crowd navigation that happened constantly at community events. When she was 3 feet away, Sarah stumbled slightly, bumping into Stevens with the awkward clumsiness of a distracted parent. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, steadying herself with a hand on his arm. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough for Sarah to accomplish 2 critical objectives. First, she palmed the phone from his jacket pocket with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been trained in close-quarters manipulation. Second, she used the brief physical contact to assess whether he was carrying weapons and identify their locations. Stevens turned toward her with mild annoyance that quickly shifted to recognition. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "Emma wanted to come to the festival," Sarah replied, maintaining the cover story while calculating distances to his associates and potential escape routes. "You know how kids are about Halloween activities." But Stevens' expression was changing as his tactical awareness processed details that didn't fit his expectations. Sarah's position, her timing, and the way she'd approached him triggered instincts honed by years of operational experience. "Where exactly is Emma?" Stevens asked, his voice carrying new wariness. Sarah gestured vaguely toward the crowd of costumed children, somewhere in that chaos. "I can barely keep track of her." Stevens' hand moved toward his jacket pocket, searching for the phone that was no longer there. The moment he realized it was missing, his entire demeanor shifted from casual suspicion to lethal alertness. "You took my phone," he said quietly. Sarah had perhaps 5 seconds before Stevens alerted his associates, and the situation exploded into violence. She used those seconds to key Stevens' phone and send a predetermined code to Martinez: "Falcon down, execute immediate." The message would trigger the federal tactical response and coordinate the arrest of Stevens' associates. But it also meant Sarah was now face to face with a trained killer who understood that his operation had been compromised. Stevens' reaction was faster than Sarah had expected. Instead of reaching for a weapon or calling for backup, he grabbed her arm with enough force to bruise and began pulling her toward a side exit. His movement was smooth and appeared casual to outside observers, but Sarah could feel the controlled violence in his grip. "We're going to walk outside together," Stevens said, his voice carrying the calm menace of someone who'd made similar threats before. "If you resist or try to signal anyone, I'll ensure that Emma never makes it home from school again." The threat against her daughter sent a surge of protective rage through Sarah that transformed her from an intelligence operative into something far more primitive and dangerous. She'd spent years learning to control her emotions during operations, but Stevens had just crossed a line that activated instincts stronger than professional training. Sarah allowed Stevens to guide her toward the exit while her mind shifted into combat mode. She assessed his positioning, identified his vulnerabilities, and prepared to use techniques she'd learned during military close-quarters combat training. Stevens was larger and stronger, but he was also overconfident about controlling a suburban mother who seemed helpless and frightened. As they approached the side door, Sarah caught a glimpse of federal agents moving through the crowd towards Stevens' associates. The arrests were happening simultaneously, coordinated by the signal she'd sent from his phone. But Stevens hadn't noticed the federal activity yet because his attention was focused on extracting Sarah before she could provide more intelligence. "Open the door," Stevens commanded, positioning himself behind Sarah, where he could control her movement while maintaining visual contact with the main hall. Sarah reached for the door handle while calculating angles and timing. Stevens expected compliance from someone he viewed as a helpless civilian, which gave her a crucial advantage. He was prepared for resistance from other trained operatives, but not from a mother who'd been dismissed as just a parent by everyone who'd encountered her. The door opened onto a loading area behind the community center, isolated from the festival activities and perfect for the kind of conversation Stevens intended to have. But as they stepped outside, Sarah heard the sound that confirmed federal agents had successfully apprehended Stevens' team. "Federal agents, nobody move." The shouts from inside the building told Stevens that his operation had been completely compromised. His grip on Sarah's arm tightened as he processed the tactical situation and realized that his only remaining option was using her as leverage for escape. But Stevens had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that Sarah Chen was exactly what she appeared to be, a suburban mother whose only concern was protecting her family. He hadn't considered that she might be someone capable of protecting herself. Sarah's elbow strike caught Stevens in the solar plexus with enough force to double him over and break his grip on her arm. Her follow-up knee strike connected with his chin as he bent forward, snapping his head back and sending him staggering against the loading dock wall. Stevens recovered faster than most people would have, confirming Sarah's assessment that he was extensively trained in hand-to-hand combat. But his counterattack was designed for someone who would retreat or defend passively, not for someone who pressed forward with the aggressive efficiency of military close-quarters combat training. Sarah's second combination was delivered with the kind of controlled violence that ended fights rather than prolonging them. A straight punch to his throat disrupted his breathing, while a knee strike to his kidney dropped him to the asphalt where he curled into a defensive position. "Sarah!" Martinez's voice echoed across the loading area as federal agents poured through the door. "Are you injured?" Sarah stood over Stevens' motionless form, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I'm fine. Stevens is secure." As federal agents moved to arrest Stevens and secure the scene, Sarah felt the familiar aftermath of combat operations, relief mixed with exhaustion and the kind of clarity that came from surviving a situation where violence had been the only solution. But this time was different. This time, the people she'd protected included her own neighbors, children who played with Emma, parents who dismissed her as an overprotective helicopter mother. The invisible woman they'd ignored had just saved their lives using skills they'd never suspected she possessed. Martinez approached with the kind of professional respect that replaced the careful courtesy she'd shown a civilian contractor. "Outstanding work, Sarah. Your intelligence and tactical actions prevented what could have been a massacre." Sarah nodded but found herself thinking about Emma, who was hopefully still safe at her school event, unaware that her mother had just dismantled a terrorist operation. Tomorrow, Sarah would return to being just a mom who volunteered for school committees and worried about spelling tests. But tonight, she'd been something much more dangerous. And when her community needed protecting, that had made all the difference. 6 months later, Sarah sat in the same back row of the Millbrook Elementary cafeteria where her journey had begun. But everything else had changed. The folding chairs were arranged in their familiar pattern. The industrial air conditioning hummed with its usual efficiency, and the scent of disinfectant mixed with coffee created the same suburban atmosphere that had once made her feel invisible. But the parents who filled those chairs now looked at Sarah Chen with unmistakable respect. When she raised her hand during discussions, conversations stopped immediately. When she offered opinions about school safety protocols, people took notes. The woman they'd once dismissed as an overprotective helicopter parent had become the most trusted voice on security matters in the entire district. Principal Morrison stood at the front of the room, holding a certificate that represented recognition Sarah had never expected to receive. The Department of Homeland Security has asked me to present this citation for exceptional civilian service in preventing a terrorist attack that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties. The applause was genuine and sustained, coming from parents who'd learned the full scope of what Sarah had accomplished during those terrifying weeks when their community had been targeted by people who viewed their children as acceptable casualties. The official story, carefully crafted by federal agencies, described Sarah as a concerned parent whose security background had enabled her to identify and report suspicious activities. But Sarah knew the reality was far more complex. She'd spent months operating as an intelligence asset in hostile territory, gathering evidence that had dismantled an international terrorist cell while maintaining the cover of suburban normalcy. The invisible woman in the back row had become the architect of a counter-terrorism operation that had prevented mass casualties. Margaret Henderson, who'd once questioned Sarah's qualifications for the safety committee, now served as her deputy in a comprehensive security program that had become a model for other school districts. Sarah's expertise has transformed how we think about protecting our children, Margaret announced to the gathered parents. We're implementing training programs based on her recommendations that will help us identify and respond to potential threats. The training programs were necessarily simplified versions of the threat assessment techniques Sarah had learned during her military service, adapted for civilian volunteers who would never need to track insurgent CELLS or analyze terrorist communications. But the fundamental principles remained the same: systematic observation, pattern recognition, and the understanding that security required constant vigilance rather than occasional attention. Jennifer Walsh, who'd made snide comments about Sarah's paranoia, now volunteered for every security initiative and frequently sought Sarah's advice about suspicious activities in the neighborhood. I feel so much safer knowing that someone with your background is watching out for our kids, she'd confided during a recent committee meeting. The transformation in how others viewed her was gratifying, but Sarah found herself missing the clarity of being underestimated. When people expected nothing from her, she'd been free to observe and analyze without interference. Now every parent in Millbrook wanted her opinion on everything from playground supervision to emergency evacuation procedures. After the formal presentation ended, Sarah lingered in the parking lot as other parents headed home to evening routines that no longer felt completely secure. The arrests of Stevens and his associates had been covered extensively in national media, turning their quiet suburban community into a symbol of American resilience against terrorism. But Sarah understood that the attention was temporary. News cycles moved quickly, and Millbrook would eventually fade from headlines and congressional hearings. The real legacy of the operation wouldn't be measured in media coverage or official recognition. but in the knowledge that ordinary communities could protect themselves when ordinary people were willing to act. Her secure phone, which she still carried despite being officially released from federal service, buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. New assignment if you're interested. Similar situation, different location. Your skills are in demand. The offer didn't surprise Sarah. The success of the Millbrook operation had demonstrated the value of placing trained intelligence operatives in civilian environments where traditional federal surveillance would be too obvious. Other communities faced similar threats, and other terrorist cells were conducting reconnaissance operations disguised as routine business activities. But Sarah's priorities had shifted during the months since Stephen's arrest. Emma was thriving in second grade, excelling in art class and making friends with the confidence of a child who felt completely secure in her environment. David had been promoted at work and was coaching Emma's soccer team with the enthusiasm of someone who'd rediscovered the importance of community involvement. Their family had found the balance Sarah had been seeking when she'd left military service. Meaningful work that used her skills while protecting the people she loved most. The difference was that now her work happened in school board meetings and safety committee sessions, rather than classified briefings and overseas deployments. Sarah typed her response to Martinez. Thank you for the opportunity, but I'm exactly where I need to be. The reply came quickly. Understood. The offer stands if circumstances change. Your country is grateful for your service, both official and unofficial. As Sarah drove home through streets that looked identical to how they'd appeared 6 months earlier, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from invisible observer to community protector. The houses still displayed the same welcoming facades. The intersections still controlled traffic with the same stop signs, and the elementary school still buzzed with the same sounds of children learning and playing. But Sarah now saw a layer of complexity that had been invisible before. She understood how easily normal routines could be exploited by people with malicious intentions, how effectively terrorist cells could operate within suburban environments, and how much difference one person could make when they were willing to use their skills in service of something larger than themselves. A home. Emma greeted her with artwork from that day's class. A crayon drawing of their family standing in front of their house, all of them smiling under a bright yellow sun. Mrs. Peterson said I should draw the people who keep me safe, Emma explained. So I drew you and Dad in our house. Sarah studied the drawing, noting how Emma had positioned the figures. David stood tall and protective beside their home, representing stability and security. Sarah stood slightly apart, her figure smaller but somehow more alert, as if she were watching the horizon for potential threats. Even at 7 years old, Emma had unconsciously captured the reality of their family dynamic. A father who provided safety through presence and love, and a mother who provided security through vigilance and capability. That evening, as Sarah helped Emma with homework at the kitchen table, where so many crucial decisions had been made, she felt the satisfaction that came from knowing her life had found its proper purpose. She was still just a mom in the eyes of many people, but she was a mom who understood that protecting children sometimes required skills that went far beyond carpools and bake sales. David joined them for Emma's bedtime routine, reading stories about brave princesses and clever heroes who used intelligence and courage to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. As they tucked Emma into bed, Sarah realized that her daughter was growing up with role models who succeeded through thinking and preparation rather than strength and violence. Mom, Emma said as Sarah turned off the light, Mrs. Peterson told us that some parents have really important jobs that help keep everyone safe. Is that what you do? Sarah considered how to answer honestly without frightening her daughter or revealing details that should remain classified. I try to help our community be prepared for problems, sweetheart. Just like you practice fire drills at school so everyone knows what to do if there's an emergency. That's good, Emma replied with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who trusted that adults would handle the complicated parts of life. I like knowing that you're watching. Out for everyone. As Sarah closed Emma's bedroom door and headed downstairs to review the next day's security committee agenda, she reflected on the strange irony of her situation. She'd become famous in counter-terrorism circles for her role in preventing a major attack, but her greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that her daughter could sleep peacefully in a community where people looked out for each other. The invisible pilot had become visible through her courage and competence. The dismissed suburban mother had become the most respected voice on security matters in her community. But Sarah Chen had simply become who she'd always been. Someone willing to use her skills to protect the people who mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new committee meetings, new security assessments, and new opportunities to apply intelligence training to the challenge of keeping children safe. But tonight, Sarah Chen was exactly what she'd always wanted to be, a mother whose child felt completely secure in a world that was safer because of the choices one invisible woman had made. When her community needed her most, the old signals had saved lives in the sky. The new signals would save lives on the ground. And sometimes, the most important revolutions began with someone in the back row who refused to stay silent when silence would cost lives. 3 years later, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her front door. A young woman in her 20s stood on the porch wearing a crisp military uniform with lieutenant's bars gleaming on her shoulders. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Jessica Martinez," the woman said. "Agent Martinez is my mother. She told me about what you did here in Millbrook." Sarah invited her in, curious about this connection to her past operation. "I'm graduating from the Defense Intelligence School next month," Jessica continued. "My mother said you taught her that the most dangerous operatives are the ones nobody suspects. She said you proved that being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage anyone can have." Jessica pulled out a folder containing applications for a new federal program. "We're recruiting intelligence operatives for deep cover assignments in civilian communities. People who can blend in completely while protecting American families from threats they'll never see coming." Sarah looked at the documents, then at the family photo on her mantle showing Emma, now 10 years old and thriving in a community that remained safe because one invisible woman had refused to stay silent. "The program needs a training director," Jessica added. "Someone who understands that the most important battles are fought by people who never get recognition for winning them." Sarah smiled, thinking about all the suburban mothers, forgotten veterans, and dismissed parents who possess skills their communities desperately needed but never recognized. When do we start? If this story inspired you, you're not alone. Every day, ordinary people do extraordinary things to protect the ones they love. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of courage, sacrifice, and the heroes hiding in plain sight. Hit that notification bell, because you never know when you'll need to recognize the invisible guardians in your own community. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that being underestimated isn't a weakness. It's a superpower.